Good evening, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Steph Garcia, and I'm the project coordinator for the Center for Preservation of Civil Rights Sites, based out of Penn Stuart Weitzman School of Design. I'm happy to welcome you all to our second Dialogues talk of fall 2022. As some of you may know, our dialogue series is designed to raise visibility and awareness about Black heritage and civil rights through conversations with practitioners exploring new concepts and ideologies in the fields of heritage studies and preservation. Today's dialogue is co-sponsored by Penn's Ian L. McHarg Center for Urbanism and Ecology. And I want to give a quick thank you to Billy Fleming, the director of the McHarg Center, Randy Mason, CPCRS's director, and Sarah Lerner, CPCRS's manager, for helping coordinate this event. Before I hand it over to my co-moderator, Douglas, to introduce our guest, I wanted to give a quick overview of how the dialogue will run for those who are new to this. The conversation portion of today will last about 45 minutes and will be followed by a 10 to 15 minute Q&A. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat, which will be located at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to get through as many as possible at the end of the talk. Doug, I'll hand it over to you now.
Thanks so much for your introduction, Steph. Like Steph said, my name is Douglas Robb, and I'm the Ian McHarg Fellow in the Department of Landscape Architecture here at the University of Pennsylvania's Weitzman School of Design. It's my pleasure to represent the McHarg Center in today's dialogue, and it's my even greater pleasure to welcome our guest, Bryan Lee Jr., to today's conversation. So I'm just going to introduce you, Bryan. Bryan is an architect, educator, writer, and design justice activist. He's the founder and design principal of Colloqate Design, a nonprofit design practice, and a founding organizer of the Design as a Protest Collective and Dark Matter University. Bryan has led 2 award-winning architecture and design programs for high school students through the Arts Council of New Orleans and the National Organization of Minority Architects, respectively. He's the National NOMA South Vice President and has been the recipient of many awards and fellowships, including the 2018 Fast Company Most Creative People in Business Award, the youngest firm to win the Architecture League's Emerging Voices Award in 2019, and most recently in 2021, the Cooper Hewitt National Design Award. And so with that, Bryan, welcome to today's conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Great. Bryan, I know much of your work, whether that's through Colloqate, Design as Protest, Dark Matter University, or DMU, and NOMA focuses on design justice in the built environment. I'm curious what design justice means to you, and if there were specific moments in your life that have influenced your work to this point, kind of what brought you here as well.
Thank you for asking that. So design justice is a framework for, and to be specific, spatial design justice is a framework that allows for us to kind of envision spaces of racial, social, cultural justice through the process and outcomes of the built environment, and to challenge privilege and power structures that use architecture and design as a tool of oppression, right? To maintain systems of oppression. And beyond that, there's a foundational necessity within design that roots itself in a kind of cultural framework. And in order to do that, you have to have a sense of what that means, what it means to kind of understand the cultural histories that exist within the particular context of neighborhoods, of communities, of cities, of rural towns and villages. All of these things have a history, a layered kind of continued history and memory that's associated with them. And design justice is a framework that allows for those things to drive design more than the typical indicators of a design problem, which might be financial, which might be purely environmental, so on and so forth. So,
and where did that interest begin?
It's funny. I just went back to Comiso, Sicily. I'm a military brat, so but I'm from Trenton, New Jersey. So I left Trenton when I was, 88, and moved to Sicily with my mother and father. This was during the kind of at the end of the Cold War. So the INF was signed, and this base that I was living on closed down. But we lived in this kind of colonized, imperialized space that was in the middle of Sicily. So it's this small little crop town that said crop, not just to be clear, crop town. And this kind of infiltration of a military base kind of supplanted itself within this environment. And I was always kind of fascinated by that juxtaposition of space and land. And so when I moved back to Trenton, New Jersey, all that I had learned, all of the landscapes and like differential landscapes that I had perceived while I was there across the entire landscape of Italy, but specifically in Sicily, kind of drove me to start thinking about those things. And one particular moment was I lived on Mulberry Street, East Mulberry Street in Trenton, and my grandmother lived in like a 3-story tiny little house, tiny little kind of row house. And I remember her legs would hurt as she walked up and down the stairs. And so I asked my parents what it meant to kind of design a new space where she felt better, where it was more communal, where there was more of what we had while we were away. And they said that's being an architect. I think probably because they didn't know what an urban designer was. So that's what they gave me. And so that was my path. I went down the kind of architecture route, and that's what drove me. And I think the kind of necessary understanding that all physical spaces, that for nearly every injustice in this world, there is an architecture, a plan, a design that sustains histories of harm and can also be a vessel for the memory of those joyful moments in response to those harms, to the resilience that is embedded in the people who navigate these spaces.
Yeah, definitely. That's such a sweet story about your grandma. Like I think your work, as I've like looked and learned about it, definitely reflects that like love of people and of place. So thank you for sharing that as well with us.
I wouldn't mind if I jump in. I have a question on some of the things that you just shared with us, Bryan. And it's, I'm so struck by how you define design justice and kind of characterize your practice and where it came from. But then on the other hand, I'm also thinking about, the preservation of sites, which is sort of what we're here today. And I'm wondering, your work in many respects seems to speak to a kind of transformational change. But when we think about, historic preservation, it often implies a kind of permanence, right? This idea that we need to fix a space and time. And I'm wondering how you kind of like grapple with those tensions in your work or thinking through the value of historic preservation.
Yeah, I think about this every day, all day. And part of it is that, I think when we talk about preservation, we really have to understand, and I think a lot of us do, but in the context of buildings, we often forget this, but there's just a layering that is often negated when we think about preservation. We kind of just hone in on a particular moment in time, this kind of still frame within the context of within a timeline. And the thing that makes spaces, places, people, moments powerful is the layering of those moments. It's the kind of residue or residual emotional response to place that binds us to those places. And so if it were purely one moment or purely just about the space, then there is no reason to preserve a thing. It only is worthy of preservation in relationship to the events and spaces and people who were involved in those things. And so it's necessary to understand the kind of entire continuum. For me, it's necessary to understand the entire continuum of memory. And so if we're thinking about the fact that moments turn to memory turns to media and monuments and memorials, and then those memorials expand and we get bigger and we think about museums, and all of these are kind of metaphor, right? When I say museum, I do mean an actual museum, but I also mean it can be the museum of the home, it can be the museum of the library, these spaces that hold a multitude of narratives within them. And then, you know, the kind of ever expanding consideration of museum to thinking about the public sphere, the mall, the way that we map things, right? You know, Steph, you have maps behind you. Like these are like those who make the map start to define, are able to define those narratives and pathways. And so each one of those layers is necessary to untangle when we think about what preservation means. And so we have to get out of that box of a kind of a singular consideration. And we also have to get out of the box of placing singular value on either just people or just the architecture. You know, we always say that architecture is the hardware to the software of life, and culture is the user interface. It's the way that we understand our complex social and physical environments, right? So think about it that way, right? Like our culture gives us the inroad to navigating the narratives and stories of our past, both from a perspective of policy and people and from the perspective of place.
I love that analogy of hardware and software. I might have to steal that for some of my own workshops. I think it's great. But if you don't mind, you touched on something now that I think is so interesting, and I kind of want to ask you a little bit more about it. And it's this way that I think your work almost challenges historic preservation as hanging on to like the official history of a place, and instead privileging these memories and these embodied relationships to, you know, domestic spaces, basically spaces that we don't often think of as being a monument or a museum or the kind of official terrain of, you know, capital D design. And I'm, you know, wondering if maybe you could just elaborate more on that idea, or perhaps even share a project that you think starts to get at this like expanded idea of historic preservation kind of beyond like sites of official history, quote unquote.
Yeah, there's a couple. So I'll get to a project, but I think the kind of expansion is really simply that, you know, when we talk about how culture is formed, there is often, you know, the kind of ingredients of that are these prevailing harms, right? So we talk about culture as the consequence of persistent circumstance in immediate, or prevailing circumstance in immediate condition. And all I mean by that is it's what has happened to you and your family and your lineage and your people over time, and then what are you dealing with specifically in this moment in time. So culture is the consequence of persistent or prevailing circumstance and immediate condition. And as a byproduct of that, culture is a way for us to remember the parables of our past, right? The lessons that we were supposed to learn, and frame them through a lens of survival, of joy. You know, culture is about resilience, right? And in order to do that, we have to have memory, right? We have to remember these places. And so I find it to be a foundational necessity for design justice to anchor itself in cultivating, aggregating, and memorializing as much of the simple yet complex narratives and stories that exist in a particular environment. So when I think of one that is near and dear to my heart, is the story of the Treme in New Orleans is somewhat known. I mean, there was a TV show about it, so if you've seen kind of the David Simon piece, but as a kind of consideration of that this place, it's the oldest African-American neighborhood in the country. You know, then we come to the 7th Ward. I know, Philly. But you know, this oldest African-American community, free community in the entire country, has seen a couple things happen. One was in the early 30s, we saw this thing called the Municipal Auditorium anchor directly on top of at the time, and still is, Congo Square, which is, again, when there were enslaved people in New Orleans, this is the only place that they had free on Sundays. They could go have market, could dance, could celebrate, could kind of relate to the spirits and our ancestors. And that was an incredibly important space this building gets anchored on top of this space, but we ended up having to reconsume it, right? So Black people ended up finding ways and nooks and crannies to reclaim that space over time. Cut to 30 years later, they attempted to run a highway like they were doing in most cities through this same neighborhood. They ran the I-10, bifurcated the Treme, lost 400 businesses, lost 400 live oak trees, and just started to decimate the kind of health, wealth, kind of social constructs within this context of this place. And so what happened was, over the course of 10 years, from 1960 to 1978, give or take, there were a lot of work around what they called the Claiborne Avenue Design Team. And really was a way to envision a space that reclaimed both the highway and the broader Treme back as a cultural institution, as a cultural fabric across the Treme, and to buffer away from folks leaving and from kind of a cultural seepage. That project died in the 80s as the kind of crack epidemic and funding from federal government was wiped out through Reagan. But in the early 2000s, after Katrina, we started to see, or I guess the late 2000s after Katrina, we started to see an increase in funding, a rethinking of this particular space. And in 2013 to 15, we started working on this project called the Claiborne Innovation District, which is a cultural market bazaar underneath the Claiborne Highway, which is the space that we've been talking about, from 19 blocks underneath this space, which is a dedicated kind of cultural marketplace that is attempting to do just what the original Congo Square did, and to kind of anchor the kind of 1960s Black Canal Street corridor, right? So if we don't anchor our designs, our thinking in all of those histories, what we end up driving is a commercial product for developers to insist upon these spaces, as opposed to rooting the kind of cultural framework back into all of the designs of this place moving forward. So that is one project that I think is really fascinating and is going to be really lovely to see come to bear over the next 4 years.
Wow, that sounds amazing and also complicated in so many ways. I'm curious since it seems like a lot of your work has to do, yes, dealing with history, but also dealing with memory work. How do you reconcile that in a project?
Yeah. I mean, often history is perceived as, the kind of defining timeline of place. Memory is so often, we do a lot of organizing and engagement work, and it's so often shunned as valid. So the stories that people tell within the context of a project meeting or a project work, within the context of project work, might end up being heard as an individual story that feels emotional to a design team or to a client, but it stops there. It doesn't hold the same weight as what is quote unquote called history. And so the kind of juxtaposition that we often, so how we deal with it in our projects is often, we do a thing called Unjust Timelines. So everybody in every room basically takes those moments in time that are historical. We lay them out on a timeline, and then we look at what the community responses were to those moments in time. Some people are still alive. They start saying, well, that didn't happen then. That happened actually in April of this year. And then these are the people who were involved. And this is actually what happened. Like we talked to, you were probably there, Steph, when we talked to David Hilliard from the Black Panther Party.
That was amazing.
It was an amazing conversation, and that conversation, one of the things that came out, and what I wanted to ask a lot of elders in the Black Panther Party for a while, was that so many revolutionaries, so many socialists today believe that there's no value in connecting with other parts of the system. But we asked them, how did you raise money for the free food program? They asked the city council, right? Like you don't know that. Like you believe that it was entirely righteous, and you are now a villain if you take any money by way of political systems. But that's actually just not how it worked, right? So understanding unjust timelines and just timelines in response to those unjust timelines gives us a sense of who was really looking at survival and who was just theorizing about justice, right? So.
Yeah, that was amazing conversation with him. I feel like I always learn so much listening to elders too. And that form of record keeping through verbal storytelling is pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's also the first step we say in design justice. Like when we talk about theory of praxis, it is honor the griot, right? Honor the narratives and stories of people who, I used to say the Miss Marys on the block, the Miss Ellens on the block who know, where the crack in the sidewalk happened in 1968 and can tell you every kid, parent who walked over that crack for the last 50 years. Those people who have the PhD on the block, right? Like they understand the place.
Very special people.
I've been sort of like sitting and like listening to you speak about, the case studies that you shared and this idea of design justice, particularly through, what you were just speaking about in New Orleans and how, and full disclosure, I'm kind of coming to this conversation from the perspective of a landscape architect. That's sort of my role. And so I'm filtering everything through this landscape lens. And something that keeps coming back to me is how questions of design justice, particularly in the context of, the preservation of historic sites or sort of working with historic sites, is also a question of environmental justice. And that these are kind of like inextricable concepts, at least, from my reading of it. And I was just wondering if maybe you could speak to that relationship between questions of design justice and climate justice, and how thinking about the preservation of historic sites might also be an inroad into thinking about contemporary issues like the climate crisis and, environmental resilience.
Yeah. There's a quote that I often talk about through Malcolm X. It says, all revolutions are based in blood and land. It is the landless versus the landlord. And the kind of critical component there is to acknowledge that land and all of its derivatives, that might be buildings, that might be crops, that might be minerals, that might be landscapes, right? Are the asset by which people are revolving around. It's the fulcrum point by which labor and power are constantly shifting, right? Back and forth. And so I, as you said, I see it as inextricably linked to one another. And so, when we talk about buildings specifically for marginalized people, we often just mean spaces, because so often all we had were landscapes. Like Congo Square is a landscape, right? Like it's a place, but the physicality of the architecture no longer exists. And so memory is driven by its spatial condition within the landscape rather than its physical structural kind of condition. And so, I think it's 100% necessary to kind of bind those conversations at pretty much at all times, because they go back and forth, and the driver of land is essential. And then I think on top of that, so many of our sacred sites are because we couldn't bury our dead in cities, because we couldn't bury our dead in places of normal occupancy, we often find these landscapes that hold our ancestors and are in kind of that cradle of history, and then we have to find ways to preserve and make sacred this already sacred land, right? And so I don't think most of the time we don't build buildings on top of that. We try to hold the landscape. So it's necessary. Yeah.
Bryan, I'm curious how you started this conversation with you being a little boy in like New Jersey and then, in Italy, and having worked with you, yeah, exactly. Having worked with you in like DAP in 2020 in such a critical year.
Yeah.
I'm curious, and I can repeat this too, because I always have multiple part questions, but how design justice has changed in the last few years. And then what role do you see designers playing in the future?
Yeah.
Kind of like how it started, where we are and where we're going kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like 2020 was the third edition of DAP, right? I mean, DAP started in 14, or well, I guess, 14, 15, and had a little momentum, lost it, and then 17 came back with a vengeance and pushed again and kind of dwindled, and now we're back to a pretty strong push. But I think all of those were driven by a compulsion to identify the places where architecture, design, landscape, all of us have said, we are too big to solve small issues and we are too small to solve big issues. This comfortable little space where we don't have to do shit and we don't have to acknowledge or be a part of the solution for any of our world's ills, right? And so many times I'm in rooms, in architecture rooms, where that is the kind of resulting answer, and it pisses me off. And I think so much of what ails us at least starts with the land, and very much is driven by how we create our cities, our rural environments, our towns, so on and so forth. And so to ignore it is foolhardy. And so I think that is its origins are kind of rooted in that kind of set of beliefs, but its growth over the last few years. I mean, I think the kind of academic considerations of design justice have grown immensely over the last few years. It was me writing in a notebook in 2008, like when a lot of the ideas for what DAP would become. Yeah. And so I held that. It was originally called Colloquial Architecture. So like there was a lot of like different names that kind of bind this work, but I think what we're seeing now is that people are able to make the connections, and a lot of those connections are connections that are beyond me, like things that I didn't have an expertise in. And so to see that pop up and be viably taught or pursued as research is it brings a tear to my eye. Like it's really fascinating to see the thing kind of grow outside of like a thing that I have to have my hand on to make it move. So yeah, it's really great.
I wonder if I could just pick up on that, hearing you sort of reflect on where your work originated, and even, some of the things that we've talked about today, this connectedness to land, this like very much, your work being like very rooted in place and landscape. But I'm struck how similar it reminds me of conversations that I've had back where I'm from in Canada, particularly surrounding, decolonial movements. And I just wonder if you could speak to maybe the ways that your work has, or that you want to start seeing it build out as a kind of like internationalist project, right? Like how do people who are working on these very place-based embedded projects start to network to kind of similar conversations happening elsewhere?
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting because I did a lot of conversations. I worked with OCAD to kind of do a series of DAP workshops there. There are DAP members all across Canada, and some overseas in Europe. And so we've had a pretty strong contingent of people who are pivoting and understanding the issues in a different manner. And so, I mean, I think one of the things that you recognize very quickly is the kind of the depth and relationship to the harms of Indigenous people in Canada is much has been unpacked a lot more in Canada than it has in the States. We ignore everything in the States from a political perspective. We kind of ignore all of our history that if it doesn't make us feel good. But specifically, I think a lot of people who are working out of Canada have had the opportunity to reframe a lot of the principles and core principles of design justice to to apply them to other kind of cultural conditions, which again I find to be pretty remarkable that it can carry across other contexts. I struggled with that originally. And you don't know a place, how do you make sure that it does that? But I think the principles are solid, and the fact that we've had so many people from so many places have input, and we've been able to organize so many people to address these issues allows us to be pretty precise on what the demands are, what our prompts are, and what our principles are.
I'm wondering how you kind of preempted a question, but how you feel about, these kind of core principles that are rooted in your, experiences in a place, watching them kind of grow and take a life of their own in these other contexts around the world. Both how that makes you feel, but also sort of where you see this, agenda that you've started kind of taking on a life of its own in other places.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I don't think anybody ever feels, especially when you're in like on the treadmill, it doesn't necessarily feel like I've done anything yet. It just feels like a lot of work to do. It feels like you're constantly striving to get to an end. And so much of what design justice is presently is only half of what it wants to be long term, right? There's still, like, design justice is the kind of foundational framework that allows us to understand how we move forward, but there's still a whole practice of, what we get from clients, which is like, okay, what happens next? Now that you've done all of this, now that you've unpacked all of this information, now how is the world different as a byproduct of that? And that takes time. That takes us being able to do projects that shift both a process and the outcomes, and giving it time for people to interact with those spaces, right? So for me, that's where I see it going. I see the ability to see the principles take action, and then to see the outcomes manifest what justice might continue to look like. With the like overarching understanding that justice is remedy within the context of existing oppressive systems, and liberation is an attempt to exist outside of those systems altogether. But regardless, both carry with them a level of trauma that still has to be addressed on the other side, right? Like, whatever the other side is, if we get free and it's a kind of liberated world that we're living in, we still carry with us all of that history. And we now have to create a new society that is always going to be at risk of increep from that history, right? Of us, kind of acting in the same ways that our that ancestors did, or that colonizers did, right? So anyway, I say all that to say, I see so much potential in the work, and I think ultimately what I've said to many people within the AIA and other professions or other parts of the professional trade organizations is that, we're here to kind of destroy you as organizations, right? Like, the intention is that the values you hold are no longer compatible with the values that we want to see in the world, and thusly we need to create a new world. So while I love you, I appreciate you as human beings, the institution, the kind of Voltron that you've built is no longer of value. So.
Bet that goes over great at the AIA generals.
They're usually fairly shocked enough to, not be able to say enough, and then I get off the Zoom call or leave the room.
Yeah.
all good.
Well, I know you feel like you haven't done a ton, but as someone who, found design as protest at a time where I was kind of questioning everything and like I need support, I want to say that I feel like you have done a lot,
Thank you.
and that's like the start of it as well, and it'll keep growing and growing as it has. And I mean, I have learned so much from hearing you speak time and time again, and from all those members, in terms of the work that I do in civil rights work and historic preservation, and just thinking of the way that I relate to land and space and people. And I'm just wondering what it means for you, since all those groups that you're part of are intergenerational and across fields, and that's part of the reason we're having this conversation with us as a group, what it means to you to be a part of something that builds community in all those groups that you're a part of, as well as in your work through Colloqate.
Yeah, there's, the kind of 4 meta principles are like, how do we think about power in relationship to place and people? How do we think about care, right? Like, who do we care for? How are we in beloved communities together? And I think that last one around care, there's a bunch of them, but I wanted to specifically talk about care, which is really to say that if we want to build spaces that engender and endure a beloved community, then we have to be in community. So many designers view community as a problem to be solved, rather than an asset, rather than humans, right? Like, I mean, I think so much of it is like we don't know communities because we don't attempt first and foremost to be a part of those communities. And so if you're working on a high school and you haven't gone to the football game or the basketball game or the volleyball game, like, and you just don't know people, then all you're getting response from are those same 20, 30 people who show up to everything, right? And so you're not really in community in terms of your design. And so you can't really speak the language of that community. So for me, building community in all of these spaces is first and foremost, right? Whether or not we do anything else, whether or not we ever like are public with another protest, another kind of activation, whatever, if we've built a network of people who found respite in a weary time and are able to find their place in this work because of it, that is the goal, is to organize first and then to build a movement around what we've organized for, which is like care for people.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I see the little prompt in the chat box for any questions. So if folks have questions, please feel free to submit them and we can answer them as well. Doug, I don't know if you have any. I feel like you want to say something.
Well, maybe while we wait for the questions to roll in, I can also just say, Bryan, while you perhaps feel like you haven't done anything, I just want to like chime in, follow Steph, to say you've done a lot, and I have found your work very inspirational for a very long time. And even just this final, kind of quote that you stated about, really kind of embedding oneself in a community and kind of grounding your work from that place also makes me think, again, from a landscape perspective, that like community also means being in good standing and good relations with, the environment and these non-human communities. And just thinking, I'm just sort of thinking out loud, it's not really a question, but this way of expanding design justice to both human and non-human environments. And I think that it's just, again, provides so many entry points to, the question of historic preservation that we're talking about today, but to broader conversations of design justice. And I just think it's such an inspirational place to ground design in.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think there's something valuable about like knowing that all of these relationships are about both building power in one another and building power in a collective. And if we know that power is essentially inert without a kind of force or directional force applied, then it is our values that drive that, right? That drive that force. And so our values are validated through the spaces and places that we design in this world. And so in racist systems, we validate the kind of hubris of white supremacy, but in liberated spaces, we validate the kind of care, love, and consideration of all people as a byproduct of that. So, so yeah, I think there's a necessity to understand how systems work, and we often don't want to do that part of it. So, anyway, I see there are questions now. So
yeah, so I'll read the questions out loud. So this is from Daniel Lim. As an architect who started a design justice firm, what recommendations do you have for architecture and landscape architecture students who don't want to work in a huge, often white dominant firm and who want to do justice-centered design work on a community level?
yeah, first things first, I would say that you have to do work now. Like, you have to live those principles first and foremost. I mean, I think part of what we look for, I mean, I think we hired a Penn grad. So shout out to Penn. Thank you. But as a student, the things that we often look for are folks who have this as a value interest already. So don't wait until you're out of school to start thinking about this. Think about how it works and embeds into your current projects. Think about how you can be a part of community now, in this, either this new city of yours or back home. And you know, what does it mean for that stuff to be translated, right? Like, there's a spatial implication to all of what design justice is, and starting to be present in those conversations today is the first thing that I would say. And then I guess the second thing would be, like, be clear with yourself about what your values are, and how they align to this type of work. Be curious, right? Be curious, be caring. I think often, and I guess the last thing I would say is we tend to acknowledge and lift those who are critical, but not cynical, right? It's a fine line, right? But like, the ability to care enough to research and get it right, to know that you're not always going to be right, and so you're going to have to kind of question again and again. But you know, critical starts from, you know, I wonder, and cynical really starts from, it's probably not possible, right? It starts from a, like, that's not going to work, but I'll look.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what I would say.
Nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Next one comes from Randy Mason, so our faculty director, who says, thanks for the rich conversation. Love the sophisticated senses of landscape, change, and memory that infuse all your design justice work. Are there stories or places where you think a more conventional pursuit of permanence, in quotations, would be justified? That is, a story or place where a more traditional notion of preservation would be relevant. I'm skeptical, meaning him. I sense you might be too.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. I think that there's like the timeline of like, nothing's permanent, right? So the timeline of preservation has to be questioned from a critical perspective. Like, who are we preserving this for? In what frame? And what level of preservation, what story, what narrative are we holding as a result of that framing within that context? So within this 100 years, we want to tell this story, and so that's what we're holding on to. You know, a lot of the projects that I work on that do have kind of significant histories on, you know, there are parts of the buildings that people will just disregard, right? Like, this is the important one, this is not the important one. Like, those things are subjective. And so, no, I don't think that there is I don't think that there should be a traditional, simply that kind of traditional way of thinking. But I will say that if someone is moving with that kind of traditional consideration, the overlay of cultural relevance, cultural necessity is critical. I don't think that can be ignored anymore. I think oftentimes, like, so, you know, that there's a question here when we were trying to remove a lot of the racist monuments here in New Orleans back in the day, that I would get asked all the time while we were doing paper monuments, which is, well, where does it stop? Like, are you, you know, we had this White League monument that was in celebration of essentially the attempt to overthrow the New Orleans government, late 19th century. And it sat in the middle of our city for 100 years. And the question was, okay, well, you take this monument down, but do you take the kind of enslaved people's warehouse that is in the French Quarter down? I said, yeah. Yeah, I think, like, you know, I mean, I think there are ways to memorialize, there are ways to hold on to things, like, but what is the value that we're trying to demonstrate, and whose values get to reign supreme over the course of a generation? So
yeah, it's a great question that I think people are still grappling with.
Yeah.
We had a similar thing happen with the Christopher Columbus statue here in Philly, where, I mean, it is people's history, but also it's really contentious history. So, yeah.
It's crazy to have a psychopath in the middle of, you know, like,
Yeah.
So anyway.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
Question from Sierra Kaylee. How do you reconcile input from the community with input from a client and a patron and so on, who might have slightly different goals and might be funding it?
Yeah, I don't care what clients say. I don't. Like, and I mostly work with clients who understand that. And I usually tell them, like, your opinion about this is A, are you going to be there in this building on a consistent basis?
Mm-hmm.
No? Okay. Well, then you are not the priority in terms of what we do here. And that doesn't work for everybody. So we don't get hired for everything, and that's okay. But we tend to try to work with folks who recognize that we are in partnership, and we are in service of a primary, secondary, and tertiary community. And so when I say that, I say, like, there's when we say a primary community, we're talking about people who are going to be impacted by this space on a consistent basis, day in, day out, right? So who are going to be the janitors, the students, the librarians, the teacher, like whatever the kind of folks who are going to be on in a space on a consistent basis, those are our primary condition, and their kind of collective communities, right? And then those folks who have an invested interest in the place, and that might be the client, that might be the developer, that might be all these other folks. But yeah, if your only investment is dollars, then I tend to just say I'm from the East Coast. Like I'm very clear about, like, who and how I want to respond to those types of things. And it's very much, you know, we're either not going to work on this project, or this is how we have to work in order for us to work on this project.
For sure. I love that East Coast pride. So we have two questions from Wingman Chu. How do you see our role in navigating the complicated space of wanting to promote equitable design with policies or social infrastructures that might inhabit design justice objectives?
Yeah. There's a slide that we often talk about, which is called the continuum of power. And it basically states that through design, we can impact pedagogy, policies, procedures, practice, projects, and people. And so these 6 things, projects, programs, can be depending on what field you're in. And the kind of general notion is that as designers, we often just stay in the project and the program space. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we'll dabble in working with people, but often people are you know, secondary to, you know, constructing or building the landscape or whatever it may be. So I think what I would say is, you know, reconciling that not everything we do has to be a designed object. Maybe we are talking about impacting, well, again, out of those pieces, we talk about signals and receivers. So signals are the kind of pedagogy, the policies and the procedures. They're often telling us how we live in society, how we need to move and operate. And then those other things, the practice that we kind of, well, our practice, our programs and projects and the people, we all receiving those signals and saying, I agree with this, I'll do it, or I don't agree with it, I'm not going to do it. And so knowing that you can design those upstream systems is super valuable. What you don't get is a lot of recognition for that, but I will give you one example. One of the best things I've ever done in my entire life, and one of the things I'm most proud of, I left architecture to work at the Arts Council here in New Orleans with the city in 2015. And for 2 years, the first thing I did was attempt to read our ordinance that defined the Percent for Art program, which was the program that I ran. So I was a civic design director for the city. And one of the things that happened was there were about 4 or 5 lines of text within this 2-page ordinance that essentially excluded dollars from these 3 sources, making our 1% program basically a 0.2% program. All of that means that $40 million were taken out of the ecosystem for artists over the course of 35 years, give or take, right? We changed that policy. It just got adopted. We changed it. We tried to change it in 2017. It just got adopted last year. This year, they're getting $5 million. When I was director, we got $250,000 a year max. So artists are going to, and specifically spatial, like public space artists are going to be able to have a living wage. They're going to be able to survive. They're going to be able to do commission projects at a much larger scale, which will give them more opportunity. And we're going to be able to help more people. Did I get to design anything? Am I going to be one of those artists? I'm not, but because we were able to find that hitch in the system, we are going to change the world for so many New Orleans artists who otherwise would not be able to stay in this city. So,
wow, that's amazing.
Yeah,
that's super cool for artists. We have time for one more question. And this is from, and I'm so sorry if I mispronounce your name, Ricarious Cheater, who asks, what advice would you give to students or young professionals that work in traditional landscape architecture offices that is working to embrace more design justice work to advance equity in the built environment?
Yeah, certainly. Well, there's a design justice newspaper, shout out to the kind of DAP newspaper, that has a index for firms. So here are the things that you can do to move your firm from one end of the spectrum, which is just kind of a equality stance, to the other end of the spectrum, which is more of a justice and liberation stance, right? So that gives you some tools to move forward. There's a new index that will come out probably every other year. But I would start there. You can also look at the DAP Designers Protest website. It's a version of it is there as well. And I will drop off some newspapers at Penn when I come home. So I still got a couple reams of them, so I'll make sure they're there. Yeah.
The newspaper is awesome. I have a copy of it in our office if you want to come and read it here too. I look at it every day to remind me as well.
Sorry, I will say one last thing. My apologies. Because I've worked in corporate firms before, and the biggest thing that I think you can do is, if you build community, the one thing that is always of value in any firm is relationships. So if you are building community and you are able to be forward in your set of relationships, and that might lead you to projects, that might lead you to new opportunities, it might lead you to volunteer opportunities, but all of those things give you a leg up in a corporate firm because that's the currency in that space. But as a second item, it also allows you to kind of dictate how you want to work, right? When I brought in projects to our previous firm, I would be able to dictate how I wanted to do those projects. And so it helped to demonstrate what I believed our firm should be doing rather than waiting for them to change on their own. Right?
Yeah, there is one more question, which I think we would just want to answer really quickly because I actually think that's kind of interesting. But Kina Volas is asking if there are different examples that you may have to mapping 2D or 3D representations that help to frame and specialize alternative storytelling, places of memory, new ways of allowing and creating space.
Yeah. Yes, one I would say on the like two-dimensional perspective, mapping narratives. So like mapping stories in place at a one-to-one scale is always really inciting. When I say, inciting, like it often engenders a lot of conversation in public space. So what does it mean for instance, when we did paper monuments, we did framing history was one part of that project, and you can look it up on the Paper Monuments website. But that project, that part of the project attempted to put these framed history posters where those issues happened, right? Like across the city landscape. So it was almost like this stumble upon. And so for folks who are not going to read maps in a traditional way, that kind of two-dimensional yet public space interfacing allows people to access the physical environment around them in a really interesting way. The second one I would say, which I still find fascinating, and I'm not really fully sure how it works, but forensic architecture does a really amazing job of unpacking acute conditions or acute issues in the physical environment. And so it maps and holds history for traumatic events oftentimes, and I think is revolutionary in that ability to kind of hold those things in perpetuity. So
awesome. Well, thank you so much, Bryan. It has been such a joy to have you, and Doug, you too. Been nice to be in conversation as well.
Yeah.
No, I've like so thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Thanks, Steph, for the invitation to participate, and thanks, Bryan. It's been inspirational hearing from you as always.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. All right, everyone. Have a wonderful evening.
Be safe. Enjoy.
Yeah. Thanks.
Bye.